Just take a little breath. It's been a big rush back into Naarm from the mountain. I live up on Corran-Warrabul. It's the two twin mountains of the Dandenong Ranges, Wurundjeri country, and I do travel quite a bit because I just love living up there. I'm happier up there, so it means I have to drive further. But it's just a great honour to be invited here this evening to welcome you all to country. I'm doing a little bit different because obviously we have an absolute queen in the room, Vanessa Turnbull-Roberts, who I've been following for quite some time. And obviously Tony Birch, who is just, absolutely incredible. And I've, again, been following his work for a long time. And I thought, I won't go on, I'm only here to welcome you to country, but I wanted to share some slides because I'm that generation now that is stepping into my role as, I'm not an elder yet, but I have permission from my elders at the Wurundjeri Council, but they're all my family, my aunties and uncles. They have given me permission to step into this role and welcome on their behalf. So I represent them, I represent my mum's siblings, none of my nan's siblings anymore, unfortunately, but yeah, I am getting older, so I'm stepping into that, even though I'd like to slow it down a bit. So I always start with the map, the real map of this continent. This is the language map, which I'm sure many of you have seen. If not, this is a really good representation of the diversity of our, I could say families, not clans or mobs, it's families, and language groups, and obviously there's dialects within those, so it's just such a diverse culture that we have. And here in Naarm, where does that little orange dot above the pink dot down the bottom there? And when you look at it in that way, it's really quite amazing to think how much happens on Wurundjeri country. In Melbourne, one of the most livable cities in the world, or one of the most colonised cities in the world. And, a lot of people call Wurundjeri country home now. People are born here, so many different cultures within this tiny little region of the continent. And I always acknowledge, I don't like using the word privilege because I stand here definitely not as someone who grew up with privilege. I had to fight and tear my way to be standing here today. I was one of the children that Vanessa is here speaking up for, and we didn't have the voices that we needed. But I'm trying to be that voice as well and share our stories here as best I can. There's so much to it, so we're just skimming the surface really. So I always start with William Barak. He was our Nuttingator, our headman, our leader, because everyone knows William Barak, and you've seen documentaries perhaps or stories around him, and he's a renowned artist around the world, so a lot of people know him. But then I always go to his sister, Borate, so she's my fifth. You're right. No, you're right, I might too. I've been talking all day in meetings. That's what happens. But yeah, Borate was Barak's sister, and I don't think a lot of people hear about Borate. She's my fifth generation grandmother, and her trajectory was very different to her brother Barak. So she suffered the violence since invasion. So she and her brother Barak saw pre and post invasion, lived traditional ways. Barak was about 12 and Annie would have been 10, Borate, when Batman arrived here and signed the Gammon Treaty. But basically they witnessed their father, Beberjan, signing the treaty with the other headmen just down on Darebin Creek, which was declared null and void by the Commonwealth weeks later, and then 3 months later, Terra Nullius proclamation was declared, so we were, non-existent. So the women on the mission, Annie, they're the voices that I want to, amplify, and the colonisers didn't speak to them or celebrate them. They, again, had a different experience. Annie had, and trigger warning, but we're in a room, truth-telling, Annie had 10 pregnancies, 2 surviving past infancy, and most of them non-consensual. So her son, Robert Wandoon, he was raised by the missionaries on Corranderk Mission, John Green, and he married Granny Jemima on the far right there. So they're my great-great-grandparents. And then you go down the line, but I don't need to do my whole family tree. I skip and goes just straight to my nan on the left here. So my nan was born on Corranderk Mission under a birthing tree delivered by her grandmother, or her mother, but her midwife was her grandmother. And then my mum on the right. So these two women raised me. We have very strong, staunch women presence in our families. And my nan was always a very happy, joyful woman, even though she, lived through the White Australia policy. She lost her language, wasn't allowed to practice her ceremony, and they were on the fringes of society. So it was, my mum was born in 1946, so that was, she was 21 when the 1967 referendum took place. So really, that's my mum who was 21 when she was then considered human in this country. So I was the first, I'm the first generation and line that has then had, and that's why I say I don't want to use the word privilege, but I had the privilege compared to these two incredible women to access education, housing, and just work to pay my bills and feed myself and my daughter, who I now raise as a strong, proud Wurundjeri woman. But yeah, I acknowledge these women, and I was a child who grew up. People used to say to me, "Oh, did your mum and your nan tell you oral history?" It's like, well, of course they did, but I lived it as well. My mum went through family violence. I went through family violence, my sister and I. We went through homelessness. When I was born, we lived in a Tarana. So when I say we lived on the fringes of society, I mean we lived on the fringes of society. So my daughter Fenna, she's in the back green room, picking out on Tony's sour lollies. She's growing up strong and in two worlds, and we don't like saying two worlds, but it's one world for them. But she's dancing her culture, she's singing in her language, she knows who she is, and that is through ceremony that we woke up, and she was 1 year old, thankfully, when we started doing that 9 years ago, and they won't hopefully remember when they learnt their language. But, we're restoring the balance through ceremony and dance. We're freshwater mob, Bidadang, which is the Yarra River. Mountain people, so again, I live up in the mountains. As Berak said, there's no home for me on the flats. We like it up in the mountains under the big trees. We're diri dancers and educators, so we use that platform to share to so many different audiences, even rock concerts and you name it. We get up there and we paint up and we dance and truth tell. We know the loggers, so this is a logging coop that we danced in, and we like to tell them how it is. We've won awards, which is really great, and the reason I'm sharing this is because we're so proud of it. And we went to dance rights actually at Sydney Opera House, and we weren't expecting to win anything. We just thought we were kind of the underdogs, but we were recognised for our rites of passage, passing on cultural knowledge from one generation to the next. So I feel that's just key for kids, key for young people, among many things, but just to feel connected and have a network. So we're not just dancers, we're a network of cultural support for each other. And the girls who are young and go to school, if they get teased for being Aboriginal or, the pretty standard things that kids can say, they know how to respond, and they're pretty solid in who they are. Scarring of country, leadbeater's possum. I get up here and I can't talk about one without the other, because we've got issues across many spaces, and obviously when country's sick, we're sick. And when our native totems, our native animals are critically endangered and being colonised and killed and displaced, that makes us sick as well. So I always then to go back to acknowledging the past, present and the future. My nan and my Auntie Vicky there, who's a staunch mentor. Auntie Joy Murphy-Wandon, who's a mentor of mine, and she's our most senior female elder. And then the future, which is our Bulbups and Burais, our next generation who, that's why we're up here doing what we do. So Baladun Yang Wangats, Naranik Stacey, Wurundjeri Willamik, Wurundjeri Balakut, Ba Jajawarang, Ba Nulai Marang, Ba Irish. Mundanai Murup Garada Bidadang, Mundanai Liwik Bulok Nugulik, Wundanai Willambik, Wundanai Tharangok Widubul Bik, Mernmut Bik, Bunya Bik, Bik Dui, Bar Bik Good, Bar Mundanai Bubups, Bar Burais, Bar Bagaruk, Bar Gulanya, Bar non-binary, Bar transgender, Bar Kiddup, Nungodjan. So in the Woiwurrung language, which is the language my nan and my mum and my great-grandmothers, they weren't allowed to speak, I acknowledge country. I acknowledge the Birrarung, the Yarra River, my ancestors, the Liwik, my elders. I acknowledge any elders who are in the room this evening. It's evening already, isn't it? I acknowledge the layers of country, which I won't go into because I'll be here for another half hour. I acknowledged the Bubups and Burais, children and babies, the next generation. I acknowledged, obviously, Bagaruk and Gulanya, women, men, but also non-binary and transgender communities, because they were, obviously we had them, and that's another thing that was removed and colonised. And Kiddup, I finally acknowledged, which just means friend. When we cross paths, we like to, we're a kinship-based culture. So, once we connect, we're kin and we're friends. So, Wamenchika, Wurundjeri Balakim and Kundibik, welcome to Wurundjeri country on behalf of my family and my elders and my old people, Nungodjan.
Wow, it's such a privilege to be here, to listen to Stacey talk, to see those images of those incredibly strong Aboriginal women. There's a 9-year-old one out the back who's going to be a beautiful handful in the future. She'll take no prisoners, I think. And just to talk about, when we say sour lollies, we're saying that in the affirmative, sweet and sour lollies, not that they were sour, as in off. She's enjoying those lollies out the back. So I'm Tony Birch. I want to welcome you on behalf of the Wheeler Centre to tonight's event. Not so much housekeeping, but to recognise some partners of ours engaged in tonight's event. Firstly, of course, Black and Bright, who are a remarkable organisation that support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders across Australia, but are based here in Naarm. People that I've worked with in the past, and particularly in relationship to their support of our emerging writers, are remarkable. Of course, we want to thank the E.W. Cole Foundation, who are the sponsors and supporters of this public lecture tonight. And we also want to thank our bookshop partners, Readings Books, who will be selling copies of Vanessa's book down the back. Readings are a great partner of this organisation and many of other cultural institutions in Melbourne, and of course the great bookshops that we love to hang out in, or I certainly love to hang out in. It's also a second, I'm stuck between these two remarkable women, and I'm so lucky. Vanessa Turnbull-Roberts, who I had not met until tonight, but I feel I know so well because I've watched her many times in the past hammering the really important stories that we need to tell on places like The Drum in particular, on other places where she's written, The Guardian, for instance. And she's been a remarkable, refreshing voice in response to articulating not only the rights, the sovereign rights of our people, but demanding that we be heard and listened to in a self-determining way. It struck me as vital last year before the referendum for the yes vote to Parliament to change the referendum, that Vanessa was one of the young Aboriginal women in particular who was saying things that we needed to hear that weren't being heard enough. And I spoke last week with Larissa Berend, another remarkable Aboriginal woman at Melbourne University, and we were both talking about the work of another great, one of our great writers, Amy Maguire. And when I think of Vanessa's work, when I think of Amy's work, these are the women who are really pushing the agenda that we want discussed, that often does not get a voice in mainstream media. So I'm very, very lucky to be here. I'm going to read Vanessa's wonderful bio so we all know a little more about her. Vanessa's going to come up and talk, and depending on how much time we have afterwards, I'll have time to ask a couple of questions of Vanessa before we finish. So Vanessa Turnbull-Roberts is a proud Bundjalung, Widubul and Wiabul woman who holds degrees in both law and social work and was recognised with an Australian Human Rights Medal in 2019. She's a human rights lawyer and Fulbright scholar whose current research is focused on unveiling the intersections of human rights, child removal, and the implications of forcible removal, ensuring that First Nation child survivors and those impacted are heard while providing solutions towards ending child removal. In 2024, Vanessa was appointed as the inaugural Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Children and Young People's Commissioner for the Australian Capital Territory, and a lot of what Vanessa is talking about, and certainly her journey, where it comes from, is in this remarkable memoir that we'll be talking about later on tonight. So please give Vanessa a big, big warm welcome.
How do I do a lecture after those yarns? That was beautiful. Stacey provided what I could actually listen to tonight instead of coming up and yarning here. But firstly, I'd just like to say, Jungi Wala Nungali Juga and Juga Nungali, Bundjalung and Widubul-Wiabul, Vanessa. Good evening all here today and tonight. I want to pay homage and deep respects to the traditional custodians of these lands, waters and skies. I pay homage to the stories that have existed far beyond the ones here today. The stories in the land, the trees, the hearts and the lands that interconnect in nurturing this place. I want to thank Stacey for providing us that beautiful welcome to country alongside a presentation that was so sacred and comes from a place. And I thank you dearly, sister, for sharing your story and where you come from. You see, while so much of this nation is debating whether Aboriginal children should be considered human or not, and we actually did just hear Stacey talk about her grandparents and things like our people being considered flora and fauna. I think it wouldn't be right if I stood up here today and didn't actually bring to the attention the national disgrace that our country is currently in. The national disgrace around what's happening in different states and territories, and in particular, the fact that we are almost one signature away from criminalising 10-year-old children and young people. There is ongoing political debates happening right now, and one thing I know that I feel we all know, and there's a reason why you made the decision to come out tonight, is that when it comes to the political discourse and narrative, Aboriginal children are always used as the bait. And that's what we're seeing happening right now. Signatures away from criminalising 10-year-old children, bringing back spit hoods and harming our children. I acknowledge this place and I acknowledge the power of protecting our spirits. And the fact that we had such a beautiful welcome to country is actually how we do that. Our ecosystems of country is very much alive. Our relationships with all these systems matter. Indigenous lives matter. Indigenous lives, knowledge, connections, and what interconnects with those systems matter. And you will learn a little bit more about that yarn tonight. And if I'm being fully transparent, when I did hear that it was a lecture, my mind went to, am I meant to have slides? Am I meant to do the academic thing? But I'm not going to do the academic thing. I really just want to have a yarn with you all tonight. And I really can't wait to connect with you all after. In a world where it's better, in a world where it's safer, in the world where all of our children come home to their families, communities, their spirits that are already protecting them. I dream of this. I dream of this world where the door knock isn't to steal your child, nor is it a knock to investigate, interrogate, or manipulate. But it's the ripple sounds to the sacred earth that protect us all. That says, Welcome home, bub. We've been waiting for you. I dream of the world where I hear the knock and I see my parents waiting for their daughter. I dream of the world. Make me cry. I dream of a world. I'm really sorry, guys. I'm gonna have to do that coughing trick you did, Stacey. I dream of a world where I head to work next week and I hear the system's burnt to the ground. We do not know what to do, so we'll need to return all the children. So we build on, and with our communities, we do that rebuilding. Because if anyone knows anything, our mob know the rebuild. Our mob are the build. I see this world, and I won't ever stop believing that this is a world we can actively have in the now. Whilst we often talk about this idea of futurism, I want to highlight our children can't wait. This world is possible. I would like to say thank you to the E.W. Cole Foundation, the annual lecture that honours the legacy of E.W. Cole, and I don't forget this. Thank you to the Wheeler Centre. Thank you to Black and Bright. You approached me earlier this year, and it was really incredible to be invited to participate here tonight. It's also incredible to be here in front of you all. I really do love this place, and the last time I was sitting here was beside amazing humans advocating for the reproductive justice. I'm honoured to be sharing this yarn with you all at such a beautiful event. Thank you for all coming out. I acknowledge all those who have spoken before me again, and all the amazing minds that will come after. I promise you this, I'm not the last, and there are going to be amazing young writers emerging. I'm Bundjalung and Widubul-Wiabul, and I am my mother's daughter and father's daughter. I'm also my community's little torment. And I'm also the person that'll probably make you wonder, how does this person have so much energy? When do they sleep? And what's going on? I recently was called back to my own country, where I sat with the mulga. The mother birthed my daughters and the placenta into the land. Mulga is the tree of our birthing. For those that may or may not know, the placenta is an incredibly healthy part of the body. It holds the nutrients, and often you hear many people turning this into pills or somehow wanting to be able to take it back themselves to put it back into their body. But for my people, we birthed this into the land, the roots. I held on to it for 2.5 years, waiting for the timing my ancestors were ready to call me to do this part. And when you listen, and I mean really listen, they are speaking to us all. The healthiest nutrition that you can access after birth, I brought it back to my country, to the land. I laid it into the earth, and with the new soon-to-be mulga that will grow and be with kin and the mulga, with Mother Earth, I gift that back to her, what she has given me, to ensure our survival, our protection, and our healing of land. You see, when we talk about sovereignty, this is not just a pretty word. It's a practice in every day. It's a practice in being Indigenous people. The land is our cultural birthright, and being able to practice our land and our cultural sovereignty is our fundamental right. And it is the fundamental right for every child and young person born as a First Nations person here in these lands and waters to have. At 10.5 years old, I was just about to close my eyes, and my father walks onto the balcony. "Bub, I'm so sorry, but they're coming to get you." It was late in the night, and it was a door knock that changed my life. 12 police officers and a welfare worker about to enter our housing flat. It was this moment that everything changed. I was forcibly removed and told to hug my dad one last time. With the hands taken behind my back by the police, it felt like I was arrested. It felt like I was in the wrong. You see, in Australia, child removal and youth incarceration continue to disproportionately impact Aboriginal children and young people. I am a survivor of the child removal regime in Australia that continues to operate and harm Indigenous children and families. I continue to see the devastating impacts this has on all of our people, an ongoing history of child removal that has not stopped. Often when our families are simply needing a hand, extra supportive need, I see the way punitive measures are used. In Australia, birth removals continue to impact Aboriginal women and children. The rising rate of this and being forced into the family policing system continues. This idea that the state can be a parent is deeply flawed, as the state cannot parent children, nor does it know love, belonging. And I spend a lot of my days advocating against this. I spend a lot of my days through the week in prison, and I spend a lot of my days with children that are in prison that fall under the caretaking of the state. And what I can promise you this is, if I was failing that many children in my own care, in my own home, there would be consequences. But when the state does it, and then the state locks up our children, they say the 4x4 wall is your home. 4x4 walls are nobody's home. 4x4 walls, such as cells, are nobody's home. I decided I wanted to study law and social work due to the disproportionate impact of the law. In my own community, and you'll read a little bit in the book, you will learn that we grew up next to a jail, a cemetery, and a halfway sexual offender's house. Ultimately, the odds were laid against us as kids. I also saw more welfare workers and policing. I knew I wanted to understand this system, and as a kid with a pretty big brain at the time, I had a lot of questions. And if we weren't trying to tackle the back of the paddy wagon cars or take the computers to try and think we could sell as kids or jumping on the back of Mr. Whippy, our families and communities were being raided by the policing state. After completing law and social work and working in a legal firm, community orgs and advocacy, and then deciding I wanted to do my PhD in decolonising child protection, and Tony Birch mentioned the incredible Larissa Brent, who's one of my supervisors, I started to see this different world, and I started to actually realise everything that was happening to me as a kid, and then everything and understanding the professional side of it, they're not that different. You see, as young people and as children, we often grow up with what's around us. So for me, being someone that was forcibly removed, being around caseworkers all the time, it was only evident I'd love to be a social worker. But then I actually realised sometimes social workers can also be the violent tool. So then I wanted to understand law. And I wanted to understand maybe there's a place in this legal system we have with process where I can actually use that legal system to benefit our children and young people. And if I'm being honest, in a history where the law has been so powerfully against Indigenous people, it hasn't changed. At just 26 years old, I was appointed as the inaugural Commissioner for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people in the ACT. When I talk about this role, and actually my age, which I often don't disclose, all I can think about is how the ancestors did set me up. And that's why I talk about the power of country and land. Because when you listen and you really listen, those old people aren't mucking around. They've got you. Thinking I was way out of my depths, I was inspired because the first time we saw the role of a commissioner with significant powers to intervene and advocate on behalf of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people, of course in the ACT. I also acknowledge that commissioners and advocates and guardians are situated throughout the different states and territories. Different powers do exist, but I acknowledge the unique fight of community that actually formed my role, because it actually came with a really staunch advocacy of independence, and it came with that statutory function to say, actually, no, we don't need to just see tokenism. We need to actually see something that exists that allows for independent oversight, where we are seeing a regime operating so fast, so tactical, so strategic, taking our children and young people. As a First Nations person from Australia, I carry the legacy of my ancestors who have coexisted with this land since the beginning of time. I'm saltwater and I'm freshwater, and from the first sunrise to the last sunset, my connection to this earth runs very deep. We are still here, and I promise you we're not going anywhere. As I stand here today, as a lawyer and the inaugural Commissioner for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people, advocating for our rights and a future and a now, where our children not only just survive, but they thrive. My work continues to have that independent oversight mechanism to intervene in matters affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people. It has broad powers to intervene both systemically and individually. I have eyes on our most vulnerable. It doesn't come lightly, but it comes with a gift that I hold incredibly close to my heart. I see young people subject to family policing and youth incarceration. I was in the United States when I got the call that I was appointed into the role by the Human Rights Minister, Minister Chan at the time. And when I got this phone call, I was working really closely with Professor Dorothy Roberts. Now, Professor Dorothy Roberts is an abolitionist, and all of her work is centred around how do we abolish the welfare state and how do we strengthen families and communities. The advice that she gave me, because I sat with her and I said, should I be accepting this appointment? Am I potentially challenging my ethics? Is it wrong? What should I do? And she said, no matter what you do, just do not make the state stronger. And I think that sits with me every day that I'm in my office and that I'm doing this work. It's how do we operate within these different spaces, where an auntie even told me a couple of months ago from the ACT, she said, Bub, we've always had our mob in different roles in different places, and we need that, but we need to always remember to work together. And for me, every day I go into this practice of work with the vision and in my heart of not making the state stronger. I don't want to see systems stronger, I want to see communities stronger. And if I'm being transparent, our communities are already strong. So how do we remove state systems from their involvement? Now there are avenues such as non-reformist reforms, which are really powerful, and that is a key component that leads towards abolition. I've sat in meetings where I've had both Liberal and Labor question me on my position of abolition of the family policing system, and often they think it's a really scary word. But if they give you 5 minutes to talk about a world that doesn't involve a system that can't parent, they'll actually come to the table. But it's actually getting around that word not being so scary, right? I continue to hear the heartbreaking stories of murdered and missing Indigenous women and children. I also want to highlight the incredible voice of Dr. Amy Maguire. Dr. Amy Maguire is a powerhouse. Her book highlights the impact of murdered and missing women. As Aboriginal women in different spaces, just like that auntie told me a couple months ago, we all need to work together. And Dr. Amy Maguire centres the voices of murdered and missing Aboriginal women and children. Again, I witnessed this impact and the violence, and we cannot turn a blind eye to these, these inequalities that continue to perpetrate the cycle of harm. We know children and young people don't just go missing. We know Aboriginal women don't just go missing, because the first thing we are taught as Aboriginal people and children is that you always have a place. If you're at a community event with mob, I might bring my daughter, Stacey might bring her daughter, you might bring your kids. And even if you're white and you decide to bring your kid to the community event and you've met mob, I can promise you one thing, mob is looking out for mob. Mob's looking out for your kid too. So there's always a place and there's always eyes on our people. So when we hear narratives such as someone's just gone missing in our communities, well, that's just untrue, because our people just don't go missing when they have connection in place to all those within our communities. Injustice is global. Justice is also global. And we are witnessing the global injustices that are targeting Indigenous children and young people. The global solidarity we share matters, and our voices matter. The lives of Indigenous children, both from here to Palestine, to Congo, to Sudan, to Rohingya, to all genocides taking place, matter. We must ensure that Indigenous voices are not only heard, but amplified in every decision that affects our communities. In a world where Indigenous lives are too often ignored or erased, we must stand firm in our resolve to make them known. My upcoming book carries a message of this resilience and defiance. It's a testament to the enduring spirit of our people. We are still here, and our stories will not be silenced. In my field of work every day, I witness the direct harms of child sexual exploitation, child removal, and the ongoing harms committed against Indigenous children and families. However, I never stop doubting a world or a place where we see this justice, accountability, and empowerment for our kids. A future where all Indigenous voices are valued and respected. I have travelled the world doing advocacy, connecting, sharing, and I just recently had the opportunity to be in Canada on the Kanakea Nation. I spoke to a survivor who also endured child removal. I was reminded in these moments, we might be oceans away, but the struggles remain the same, and our fight is always intersectional. I see the devastating impacts of global genocides using prisons as a tool, isolation, and deprivation leading to death. I'm not saying nothing new here if I was to mention to you the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody. And it wouldn't be justice if I stood up here and talked about our children and young people, talked about family policing, without highlighting the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody. No matter what we do, no matter who I'm speaking to, whether it's academics, researchers, frontline workers, social workers, lawyers, barristers, doctors, whatever space you're in, if you're in that space and you haven't heard about the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, then there needs to be a really strong reflection of the workplace that you're in, because that report is one of the key reports that highlights the very direct moments and use of things such as incarceration, such as family policing, that also allows us to understand the narrative of why we are and where we are today. Family policing, criminalisation, all this have been fundamental tools of the regime of assimilation, displacement, and of course land grabs for Indigenous people. They weren't taking our children to say, hey, how about you have that piece of land over there and grow a tree? They were taking our land so they could build a fence and own it. When we look at history, we know this now. When we open our social media, you'll see it right now if your algorithms haven't stopped it. I've shared a little bit of my story and the work that I do and the field that I'm in every day. The journey of I want to share a little bit about the family policing regime and how it operates. And it's not different from, again, history. In saying this yarn, I acknowledge the first survivors impacted by the stolen generation, the survivors who are still navigating their way home, and the survivors who are fighting for their grandchildren to come home. Often, I'm met with the children who have their own parents who have been impacted by that system, being forcibly removed. This Saturday marks the 100th year of the opening of the enslavement institution, also known as Kinchela, or Kinchela Boys Home. Kinchela was one of the first facilities that our elders were forcibly separated from their families, and our women were taken to Cootamundra. I acknowledge this, and I acknowledge what Saturday means. I call it enslavement and a facility of training because that's what happened to our people back then. My great-grandmother was a slave on her own lands. My father wasn't considered human for more than half his life. And then his daughter, myself, was forcibly removed by the system. If that does not highlight the impact of history and the regime doing exactly what it's designed to do today, then I don't know what does. The family policing system here in Australia is one that operates on the basis of risk and racism, the double R. The family policing system, moving to the process of becoming privatised even more, similar to the crossover of the way we're seeing prison systems become privatised, some are still run by government, is a way where they use things such as surveillance, prediction, and bias. Surveillance is the tool where they use other things such as teachers, social workers, the health system, those within different spaces to actually surveil you. And then you have the department themselves, often operating again on that narrative of risk or ROSH reporting. ROSH is a term that stands for risk of significant harm. Through the process of understanding risk of significant harm, there comes the prediction. So I predict through this risk of significant harm that this is the likely outcome of this child and what's going to happen if we don't take them. But what I challenge ministers, what I challenge the department is, but what's the greater risk if you keep them with their families and you support that mother? What's the greater benefit if you choose to say, hey, because your child's clothes are dirty at school, because there may or may not be use of drugs in this situation, because you're subject to domestic, family or sexual violence, instead of punishing that child and forcibly separating them from their families, just imagine we said, hey, what do you need in this time and moment? Imagine, instead of taking that child whose mum has been almost beaten to death and struggling, imagine we took that mother and that child, and it wasn't the department or police, and we gave them safety. Imagine a world where we allowed child and parent survivors to be together. Imagine a world where we didn't separate siblings. Imagine a world where today, right now, we're not speaking to elders saying, Mum, Dad, where's so-and-so? Oh, I don't know where my brother is. Or I don't know where my cousin is. And then there's the bias. And the bias is the fundamental tool and the foundation of this country, which is racism. And racism does exist in the family policing system. And I call it family policing because it acts as a form of criminalisation in the lives of separating children from their parents. If we are serious about putting Indigenous voices at the heart of global decision-making, then we really must get creative, must get tangible and coordinated, and ensure that Indigenous lives actually do matter, and that our children and people that are subject to inadequate responses and further harm are no longer subject to that. That means when there is a murdered or missing First Nations person, that their life is taken seriously. We are still today investigating the bodies and the bones, the women, the children, the people that have still not had justice. In a time and place where AI and technology is developing quite fast, suddenly when you mention the lives of Indigenous people, we don't apply it there. My call to action to every person here is to ensure that we are aware of, one, the land that we are visitors on, and that we are just that, visitors, unless you're Stacey on this country. And what your contribution is to the visitors on the land that you are visiting on. How are you ensuring that Indigenous children and young people are centred? Whether that is through funding local community organisations, raising awareness to the cries that we are calling for when it comes to help, whether you're participating, if you're invited, to local community events and engagement, and ensuring that when silence remains in the shadow, that you rise with the light to ensure that it's no longer dark for our people. In a world or country where I find Indigenous voices are silenced for far too long, through both legislation and practice, I urge all here today to learn about that history. There's a responsibility on all of us here tonight, and there's a responsibility on all those that are not here tonight. I'm a survivor, and I'm now in a role where I do not live in survival anymore. Tony asked me earlier, how did you feel writing the book? And I said, it feels like a whole lifetime ago, to be honest, because I often find when you're given the opportunity to externalise, be heard, which when we're talking about trauma survivors or those that have impacted by any form of trauma, you want to be seen, heard, and validated. I'm not looking for validation, by the way. But in terms of completing the book, that does feel a lifetime away. But it is a book that it is a bit of a long yarn short. It's easy to read through, but it's also a world and a book and a piece of writing that allows everybody in this country to understand that we do not have to enact further harm in our communities, and that strength lays within community. And so I'm deeply honoured to have shared that with you all tonight. I'm deeply honoured to be here. And what I will share is injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. The better world is possible and the better world is now. And from the first sunrise to the last sunset, we will still be here no matter what. Thank you.
Wow, that's fantastic. What we're going to do, people know I'm a stickler for time, but I've been given permission so people don't get restless. It's 7:27 and we'll go to about 20 to 8. So I've got about 12 minutes and then, of course, we're going to have the book sales and Vanessa would be available to speak to people. Thank you so much for a wonderful conversation. I want to start... we'll probably have time for 2 or 3 questions, but I want to ask you something that I asked Larissa last week, and it's part of a conversation Larissa and I had been having for some time, and certainly a conversation that began before the Voice campaign. And one of the things that strikes me, and it strikes me so much listening to you tonight, it struck me with Larissa last week, who I've known for decades, but also it came about when I was in Sydney last year and Larissa was hosting a panel where 2 Aboriginal women, one working in family violence, one working in a space around children being detained. And I was thinking about the Voice to Parliament, about how we were offered a seat at the big table where we could go and behave and we might be listened to and we might be able to give advice and it might be listened to, it might be ignored, but it had no authority, no power. And to be honest, when I hear you speak, when I hear Larissa speak, and last year when I heard these 2 deadly women speak, I actually thought, all of you women, you've bypassed the big table. You're at the front line. You're doing the real hard work and you're doing it with such authority and passion. Did you feel during that period of, to me it felt like you're being patronised almost, that our voices, as if we were children and we would be finally given an opportunity to speak. But all of you women, you're doing this incredible work. It seemed to me to be such a flip of what was actually happening. It wasn't recognising any of the great stuff you've been doing.
Absolutely, and I think you hit the nail on the head where Aboriginal women in particular, and I know Stacey's checking on her little Burai Jardram, but Aboriginal women have been so far silenced historically that there is a massive tide changing in how we position ourselves right now. And I think that's one, because of the fight and what our Aboriginal women have endured historically. But when you talk about we're already at the front of the table, I almost imagine that table burning because we don't need to sit at that table and ask for those crumbs to say we deserve to be here. When we know the solutions, we know what works. And so, I really admire Professor Larissa Brent with such a high regard, because she's part of those women that are paving the way for me. And then that little 9-year-old and listening to her mum come up here is paving that way for her in the back. You haven't met the beautiful 9-year-old in the back, but she's in the back.
She's very loud.
She's
in a best way.
Yeah, and I just think in terms of we've always been speaking, we just haven't been listened to, and we've always had a voice. It's just been suffocated by things such as the state systems that have taken away our air.
And I know you were very generous before in inviting non-Aboriginal people to become involved, in the rights of our children. You're inviting non-Aboriginal people to bring their children to mob and hang out and stuff, which is very generous. I think also that, my way of, again, when I hear you talk, I think that we need to invite or almost say to non-Aboriginal people, you need to hear us. You need to hear us. You need to engage with us. We can't be forever silenced. And there's nothing worse than listening to people like you talk and reading Amy Maguire's remarkable journalism and it not being heard. And I think that my frustration in relationship to the Yes campaign is that there were so many articulate voices of younger Aboriginal people, your generation and a bit older, who were saying everything that needed to be said to have a really constructive but serious discussion, and it wasn't getting into the so-called mainstream of that discussion and that debate. I mean, as I said, I remember seeing you on the drum and really trying to push something that was really intelligent, really vital, but it's sort of also then getting sort of suffocated by all the voices that, if nothing else, they didn't want the discussion of the voice to be too difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because as a Bundjalung and Widubul-Wiabul woman, sharing my perspective and a perspective of sovereignty, but also it's like we're not allowed to question things, but yet you have a whole racist campaign that is given all of this time, this air, and they're more valued as opposed to actually, but what about this Aboriginal woman that's actually just asking a few questions and wants to understand a few more things? Yeah. And so again, it's the colony and the racism that overtakes even when we're choosing to actually just critique and have a conversation. And
I think the other thing that's again, when we think about the erasure of history or the refusal to have a really strong discussion about history, now we're looking at the history of the voice referendum. And again, Amy Maguire, my daughter Nina, who I hope is here, sent me an article. There she is. Sent me an article, one of Amy Maguire's articles, which was a really vital piece of writing about what had occurred, the problems, what we now face. And I think Amy Maguire has to do a lot of this stuff on Substack now because a lot of her really important journalism doesn't get to those mainstream publications because it's too difficult in the sense it's asking the serious questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. Agree.
Now, I want to ask you something else, and it's been something that is, I suppose, I brought this up quite a lot, and you mentioned again, so people may or may not know, with the election of the new government in Northern Territory, they're looking at reducing the age of responsibility. They are, as you said, bringing back spithoods. So all those draconian practices, which we know go on right across Australia, but it's remarkable to consider this. So if we think again of the rhetoric of whether it be called reconciliation or whatever, is that in 2016, as you will know, there was a initially there was an investigation by the Four Corners program into the shocking torture of
Bridget Brand?
At Dondale Detention Centre in 2016, led to a Royal Commission. That Royal Commission, of course, made many findings, as you were talking about deaths in custody, Royal Commission, many findings that were ignored. How is it, and I know it's a big question, but we have this horror occurring now 8 years ago. How is it that we're 8 years on, the centre's still open, some of the same people still work there? We're actually saying now we're going to subject our children to the same atrocities. How can that exist as a reality in Australia? And then we have this mythology about Australia being a place of equity. And again, a lot of the rhetoric around the Voice campaign was about equity, when this is such a gross inequity in Australian society that, well, it's not, I would say it's not only tolerated, but I think one of the things that you're indicating is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are the plaything of conservative politics who are used as the troublemakers, always used in law and order campaigns to bring in more police. So it's almost like it's a celebration of this violence. Absolutely. How do these two things exist, and how do people continue to accept this this lie?
We're getting deep. We're getting away from the yarn on the book. Let's get into and this is what I want to talk about, because we live in a colony, right, where we saw our national leadership in this country respond faster to property damage than murdered and missing Aboriginal women and children. And when you talk about it becomes that political debate, and in particular post-referendum, and now our kids are now the bait of this conversation, it's because it brings up the biggest thing that actually almost justifies, in the eyes of colonisation, this conversation around property. And so property and terra nullius, and using things such as putting fences up to say, well, no, this is our land and this is where we're building and this is our place, and you as Indigenous people are not traditional owners of this country, you're considered an animal. That rhetoric still sits within, this is recorded, isn't it? I've got to remember my role. But this sits in the rhetoric of the imperialist thinking of property again. So if you're looking at the political votes now, what's going to cause people to have a bit of a jump and a bit of a freak out? It's, oh my goodness, is my property safe? And so when you look at the conversations, whether it's media, whether it's correspondence in your local communities or whatnot, from people that don't understand our communities or people, what we've been subject to, you start hearing those conversations around, oh, youth crime's on the rise, or no, like, my car's being stolen and my house is being broken into and they're going to take my land and they want my backyard, and all of this racist rhetoric. And so when that fuels the population and they can use that and grab that at the political level, it just goes back to history about property.
Yeah.
And so they're bringing it up right now. Okay, property's damaged.
I will finish with a question about the book. Don't worry about that. But it does make me think what you've said. There's a weird combination. So you think about the prison architecture. When I was in Alice Springs visiting my daughter a few months ago, there's like an apartheid architecture, physical architecture of people building houses with huge walls and razor wire. And I thought, initially I thought, oh, is this a lockup? No, it's just a white person's backyard. Yeah. So I will, to close, I suppose in a way now thinking...
I write a bit about that in the book though. I talk about a chapter growing up on Gadigal country, and we call it the suicide towers. I don't know if any of you might know Redfern.
I do have your book.
Yeah, and you'll read it. And but it talks about the way the suicide towers, where there's been many deaths in custody, the way it's been intentionally built is it's actually built housing commission, where it's made up of a lot of our mob, are purposely put off the ground, which we're relational ground land people. So why are we being displaced and placed on these high places of what isn't safe, and then it's a 4x4 housing commission states? And it's almost like the rhetoric set you up for
I was just thinking, it's a terrible sort of segue, but I was thinking we were so lucky when we moved into the Richmond Housing Commission high-rise that we were on the first floor, so our dog could jump over the balcony and go for a run, then come back up the stairs. But anyway, I want to finish with one question on the book. Yep. So as a writer, I always think when I've finished a book, I have a sort of a wish fulfillment of what I hope a reader will enjoy or get from the book. So now that the finish of the book, it's out there, it has a life. What would you hope for the book, in the sense of, you're going to have a lot of non-Aboriginal readers. Most of our readers, in percentage terms, are non-Aboriginal readers. What would you hope a non-Aboriginal person would get from the book?
I never thought of it the way you just shared it. The book has a life of its own now.
Like, yeah, well, it does. You can't control it.
And I was with Yasmin Majid in New York last year, and that's actually similar advice. I said, what's the best advice you're giving before the book's officially released? And she had said, well, when that book's out there, and readers are holding it, it's completely out of your control now. Yeah. It's going to be between that reader, their perception, their knowledge and experience.
Absolutely.
And I think that's why I wrote with such a flow, where they're almost, not that I want to control the way it's perceived by other community members, including Indigenous and non-Indigenous, but I wanted to produce something that was actually quite flow and effect, where you could read this no matter which side you were on, whether you are Liberal, whether you're Labor, whether you're Conservative, whether you're like, I have no idea, or whether you're completely invested in Indigenous politics or injustice, that you can read that and be like, oh, wow, this is happening. Prisons are privatised and they're actually a business. Oh, wait, my taxpayer money funds the government, which is funding a separation of a family, which is actually, they could have prevented that. And so for me, I would like readers to be able to pick up this book and be like, okay, wow, there is a better way we can do things. It's coming from me, a survivor of that very same system, and now in a position to reflect. So I actually don't feel like I am that book, but that book was me at some point in my life. And so when you get to freedom, and I say this all the time, the best thing you can do is actually try and free other people with you. And I'm in a very privileged position, Tony, where I'm at the moment, and I don't take that for granted at all. But I also can't forget where I come from. And I can't forget the struggle and the fight. There are kids still being separated. And so I just hope for all readers that they can hold this book and think, this is, I sound like I'm quoting The Voice, this is an invitation. Vote, no. Stop stealing kids, no. But just like hold that and recognise that it's an offering and a gesture to the nation to say, actually, we can do things better. Stop
Yeah.
stealing our kids.
Yeah, so I just want to say to close again, please have a look at Vanessa's book and have a chat to her. But I just want to say something really important in closing, that when I was with Larissa last week and thinking about how far she has come as an Aboriginal woman who is just an intellectual leader in this country and a very obviously vital creative person as well, that when you see what Vanessa is doing at such a young age, I can't express how proud as an Aboriginal man I am of that and of our communities across Australia, how proud we are of Vanessa, and to say again that we don't need to be invited to sit down. We have people like Vanessa who are at the coalface, and all we need to do is pay them respect, listen to them, and learn from what they have to say if we want real change in the country. So please thank Vanessa very much.